Go ahead and take a look at this map of New York City. Now, you'll notice that in Manhattan here, there's this really important thing, which, is Central Park, right? And today in this video, I want you to think about what the city would be like without the park, but maybe more importantly, what the park would be like without the city.
I'm Oliver from CNET. I have a question actually about market share, which is sort of what we're getting at. There has been a suggestion that because of pricing and design, Apple tends to appeal to kind of a smaller elite rather than that sort of mass customer base. And so I guess once and for all, is it your goal to overtake the PC in market share?
I can tell you what our goal is. Our goal is to make the best personal computers in the world and to make products we are proud to sell and would recommend to our family and friends. And we want to do that at the lowest prices we can. But I have to tell you, there's some stuff in our industry that we wouldn't be proud to ship, that we wouldn't be proud to recommend to our family and friends. And we can't do it. We just can't ship junk.
When it comes to the consumer AI race, Apple has two distinct advantages. The first one is its taste, and the second one is its developer community. I want to focus in on that first one today, its taste, because I think the current crop of AI products that are out there is representative of what you shouldn't do when it comes to AI, namely that it lacks taste, right? Now, the paragon of problems with this current crop was the Humane AI pen, which had three distinct issues. The first one was that it was slow. The second one was that it was limited. And the third one was that it was inaccurate. Now, the first one is something that's solvable by the AI, the technology itself. It's not inherent to the AI, but was an engineering problem to be solved. And in fact, with ChatGPT 4.0, we've already seen a lot of that latency get reduced or collapse essentially altogether. So we're going to ignore that one for now, which leaves limitation and inaccuracy. The Humane AI pen suffered from this limitation and inaccuracy, because it was trying to do everything from the bottom up. It basically was a glorified ChatGPT wrapper with not a lot of extra technology built around it. And so what I want to ask is whether the current platforms that are out there have more leeway because of the technology that they're building on top of, and sprinkling a little bit of like AI sauce on top, whether it buys them more leeway in that limitation and in that inaccuracy. The holy grail of consumer AI right now is a conversational virtual assistant that can actually take actions for you, which is why I think there's effectively 3 companies and 4 platforms that have an opportunity to take over, I guess. And the first one is Microsoft. Microsoft, with Windows, has that opportunity. They launched Copilot as an attempt at a first swing at that type of space. The second one would be Android and Google. It's a huge opportunity there. Google has been arguably at the forefront of AI, and now has the potential to go from end to end, from AI to device, with Android and Pixel. And then of course there's Apple. Apple has 2 platforms, iOS and macOS, that have this ability. Of course, you could count all of their other things, but effectively iOS and macOS is the 2 biggest opportunities. And each of these platforms share one thing, which is pre-existing functionality created by developers that they can then leverage based off of this technology. The reason this is the holy grail is because it is a superhuman interface, right? A superhuman interface is just this thing that takes a relatively small amount of input from the user and amplifies it into this relatively large piece of output, or something that goes faster or quicker or does more based off of a small amount of inherent input. I think that is what Jobs talked about and what he meant when he talked about a bicycle for the mind. So let's go ahead and torture that metaphor a little bit. If you were to apply the current problems of AI products to the bicycle, this is what you'd end up with. Let's start with inaccuracy. Let's imagine that a bike is inaccurate. Maybe you start pedaling and suddenly you get a very fast output. right? You go really, really quickly, and then you maybe keep pedaling, and for some reason, even though you're pedaling the same pace, it slows down a lot. It would feel uncontrollable. It would feel like the bike is unusable and unsafe because it was giving you the wrong thing at the wrong time. Maybe even worse than that, maybe at certain speeds, you turn the handlebars and the wheel goes the opposite direction, but then other times you turn that same way and it goes the other way. That's what it would be like. It would be unacceptable for that as a product. What about limitation? Well, that would be like a bike without handlebars altogether. Also something that maybe you would get some use out of. You go kind of straight, you can kind of turn by leaning, but ultimately without those handlebars, you're limited in functionality, what the bike can actually do. Importantly, the handlebars represent a affordance of the bike, where the human and the bike meet, right? They are a signifier that the bike has the ability to turn, something that we know that AI has sort of struggled to do, provide signifiers about the capabilities of a device. So let's go ahead and return to the two problems that these devices have one more time. First one is limitation, and the second one is inaccuracy. A limitation is when the human lacks context about what an AI can and cannot do, which is the handlebar problem, right? The second one, inaccuracy, is when AI lacks context about the world or what the user wanted. If I were to bucket these into two broad, generalized concepts that relate to user interface that we've talked about in the past, the first one is that limitation is about low information density. Like, it would be like having an iPad that was one button. You could only have one button at a time on the screen, and then you'd swipe to the next button and see what it could do. Inaccuracy is more like having low input resolution. It's closer to a finger, for example, than a mouse, or maybe it's closer to a finger than the Apple Pencil. And in the worst case, if it's very low input resolution, it would be like having a hand, like literally my entire palm, as the only thing that could control my device. Maybe I'd be able to press a button that was on the screen, but my iPad would have to guess what I meant most of the time. Here's the important thing about input resolutions. The worst case input resolution often determines that signifiers or that affordance's size on the screen, its prominence, its ability to be shown, right? So if you have a high input resolution, you end up with a small affordance, and lots of them. That's why you end up with high information density. If you have a low input resolution, then you end up with a large affordance, which means less information dense, kind of like an iPad with your finger, because your finger is a larger pointer than a mouse is. The important thing, though, to take away are these two things. Information density and input resolution. Those are the two things you need to know about. And each of those have enormous effects on the design of the entire system as a whole. More often than not, though, the input resolution defines the input. The input resolution defines the information density. You move into these superhuman interface like areas of the world when that input, no matter what it is amplified with the technology to achieve something that a user wants to do. The iPhone does this, by the way, and so does the iPad, and so does really any device, by breaking functionality into apps. A touch at pixel 100 over and 300 down means different things depending on the context of the app that it's showing, right? Apps provide context for making something happen, and small human interactions end up having profound superhuman effects as a result. Roughly speaking, this is what a large language model and a chatbot looks like. You start with tons of reference text. Think like the web, basically. Then you do some training here, and it creates a large language model. That is all happening before you even put the chatbot up, right? All of those things happen. Well, once you have this large language model, then you can turn it into a chatbot. And the way that you do that is you take a prompt, you combine it with the LLM, and you generate some text based off of that. You say, large language model, what is the most likely thing to come after this prompt, right? Well, what happens is that it then generates some text based off of the prompt, and after that, you use all of that plus another prompt to generate even more text. It keeps going in this virtuous cycle, loop, 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 over and over and over again. Now, what happens when that's the case? Well, you end up with you end up with those problems that we talked about. But it's different depending on if you're in a low context situation versus a high context situation. In a very low context situation, you end up with low precision when you have a low prompt length. When this prompt is really small, you're not very precise with the output that you get. Of course, when the prompt length is bigger, then you end up with more precision, and you end up with a curve that kind of looks like this. It's like going up and to the right quite a bit. What about in high context situations? Well, in high context situations, even with a short prompt length, you end up with pretty high precision. But if you have a very long prompt length, well, then you end up with even more precision than that. So you kind of flatten this curve a little bit, and you make it so that you boost the baseline of what the quality of that response is, essentially. Now, both of these actually can be reduced into a single graph because prompt length is just part of context. So in this graph, you talk about the precision of something versus its context. And in that case, the lower the precision, the lower the context, and vice versa. It looks something like this. So really the name of the game is high context, and high context that operates very well with a relatively short prompt length from the user. And this is an important principle to understand, that AI interfaces tend to lack precision because they actually lack the context. This is why existing platforms have a huge advantage. It's because the actions that a system can actually take provide this sort of subsystem, this AI subsystem, the context needed in order to achieve it. So let's take a look at this original diagram one more time and see what happens when we add an AI subsystem to it, or when we add it to an existing system. Well, what you might have here is a set of actions that are available, or a set of things that an AI can do. That adds more context and you can combine it. So once you combine these three things now, suddenly you end up with a much better output, not only in terms of generated text, but also in terms of achieving the actions that you wanted to achieve in the first place. This is all happening because the worst case for input resolution, the worst case scenario for input resolution is this arbitrary prompt, right? A low context, low prompt length. And without any additional context, you would imagine that you'd want a UI to be shaped around that. But because we want relatively high precision, well, it makes sense that we want to incorporate higher context into the device and into the system that the AI is trying to make sense of. And so without the park, the city is more just like a city. And without the city, well, the park doesn't really mean too much. And so I wanted to read you a comment that kind of kicked off part of this. It's from @LilMichael212, a viewer of the channel. They left it on one of my videos, and they said, "I really do think where AI assistant UI really explodes and new technological properties emerge that weren't possible before is that the convergence between AI and powerful but low friction spatial/AR devices. When AR hardware catches up to the functionality of these powerful models and they can break free from the 2D and have a real sense of presence in our lives with real-time, real-world shared context through something like glasses, that's when all this stuff really makes sense and really has a soul of its own, like you said. I largely see AR being the way we give eyes to AI and invite them into our lives in a real way. Until then, they'll largely be useful, glorified Siris on our phones. The next era, however, comes when AI truly sees what we see, augmenting your world in really useful ways, and you don't really even think about it much." That's the long-term vision for this stuff. Shared context worn on glasses. And in fact, I think Zuckerberg has even mentioned it with the Ray-Ban, like the Meta Ray-Ban combination things, that it's really the ultimate form factor for that type of AI device, which I always found fascinating and only kind of believe even more now. But importantly, the other piece of that is the ability of those devices to leverage the existing things, the existing tools that we've created for the last 20 years at this point on our phones, in order to achieve more with less friction in certain contexts. So in the shorter term, the closest thing we have to a digital twin, other than in our eyes, that's our phone, really, right? Think about how much stuff you put on your phone, how often you carry it with you every single day, and what that means for providing context to a virtual assistant. It really means everything. And as always, when it comes to Apple, their design chops, their ability to know the limitations of technology and implement it in a way that makes it more straightforward for the general public, well, that becomes one of their biggest advantages, let alone the fact that an ecosystem allows them to be present along all the devices, and the more devices you have, the better these things have context about your life. I'm excited to see what's going to happen with Siri next week. And again, thanks for watching. Appreciation to Lil Michael 212. See you next time.